welcome to my esteemed panelists. Of course, social justice gets short shrift, so our panel has been condensed to 30 minutes because the politicians talked so much, but that's okay. We will try and make up for it in the interestingness of the panel discussion. So I'm going to start with a question that I'll ask each of you to answer, and we'll start this side with you, Sisvu. And the question is about 20 years on, what is the role and place of civil society in struggles for social justice? And particularly, I want you to say, is your job to deliver services, or is your job to fight for democracy? Because many people say community organizations are there, providing services, but we have a government to do that. So what's the role? Is it services, or is it democracy?
Well, I come from a social movement that does not believe that civil society should be delivering services, because that's the role of government. A treatment action campaign is one of those organizations where we push government to deliver on its mandate, which is in the Constitution, and where it fails to do that, we know that there are platforms using the Constitution and the straits through active citizenship to ensure that government does deliver. So no, I don't think civil society should be delivering services, because one of the excuses that many of the governments across the world, particularly in Africa, is that because they are funding one organization doing a social service, a service in some way in Idujwa, that they think they've done it all by just saving 2 women from gender-based violence or saving 2 men from dying from HIV, that they've done it all. Because we do let them to get away with that excuse. So it's not our role. Our role is to ensure that citizens on the ground are mobilized to hold government to account for what it should be delivering, which is services.
Fatima?
I'm going to answer that slightly differently. I mean, obviously, I've been a civil society activist, and I don't think it's our role to provide services or to be providing the funding for services. I think it's a constitutional obligation of government. That's why we can hold them to account in terms of various provisions of the Constitution. But I also think that one of the discussions that hasn't happened today is that it's also the role of the private sector. So if you look at the 10 billion per annum investment by private companies that are investing in services from creches to orphanages to providing education to providing healthcare facilities, I think we need to have a serious discussion in this country about redistribution of wealth, which also involves then a role for the private sector to be providing services. I think too often government gets the blame for exclusively having to provide those services, even though it is, of course, their constitutional obligation. And I think that discussion needs to be prioritized now. And Carl van Holt has written about that in a recent paper, where he argues that because redistribution hasn't happened in the last 20 years, the site for accumulating capital has been in the state, but also the site for expression and for protest and for the demand for public delivery is happening at a local and a municipal level. And of course, I think it's our role for everyone, the public sector, the private sector, and civil society, to be building democracy and to be advancing and promoting it. So I believe that they're interrelated. I'll just give you one example. When government is in denial and when government is causing the premature suffering and death of people living with HIV/AIDS, we actually helped civil society to provide those services of ARVs in terms of the first site for ARV treatment in Kailicha. But that was done on a once-off basis to show government that it was possible and that you actually can provide services in a country with such huge inequalities as ours.
Yeah, thank you, Sisonke. I don't think that the role of the civil society organizations is to deliver goods and services at all. I think its principal role is to ensure that and this is what the other 2 speakers have effectively said, is to ensure that the state delivers on its mandate to provide basic goods and services. And I think this is similarly about the private sector, which feels, particularly in its CSI type work, feels much more comfortable adding trivial amounts to massive health and education budgets than in supporting institutions that keep government honest, keep government delivering. And that's really what I think we're about. That's what I think all civil society and social justice organizations are about. So they don't deliver goods and services, they oblige the state to produce on its mandate and on its promises, and to that extent deliver democracy. They deliver democracy in the sense that utilizing the constituencies that they build, because they could not persuade the state to do what they have to do, what it has to do, without the backing of a constituency. It holds the state accountable, and that, I think, is the essential role of civil society and social justice organizations.
Okay. I want to come back to this and explore it a little bit further, because there are some among us, or maybe not among us today, but Honorable Blade Nzimande would raise serious questions about how rooted organizations like yourselves are in communities where there are NGOs that provide services, right? So there are NGOs that provide counseling services, that provide things that people can touch and hold on a regular and continual basis, that aren't quote-unquote troublemakers, that aren't talking the language of democracy, right? So I want to explore that just a little bit further, and I want to get your take. So Fatima, you said that for some time, when you're kind of trying to role model what the state should be doing, there isn't a provision of ARVs, the state needs to do it. We need to prove to the state that this is how you do it, so that there's a role and a place for that. But what do we do of all the other many small organizations that are out there that are providing services? What role do they play? Are they part of this democratic conversation, or are they extensions of the state? Tell me a little bit more about that kind of, that range of voices that exists within civil society.
So, I can only talk about my new experience, where at the Open Society Foundation, we're funding about over 180 different civil society organizations, from your middle-class NGOs to your social movements that are rooted in communities. In fact, we brought today 40 young civil society leaders who are actually the next generation of civil society leaders. And maybe you could all just stand up. So, this is the future of our country. And so they themselves will tell you when Comrade Blade Nzimande makes these accusations. I mean, Vuyiseka and I have been called troublemakers our entire professional life. And I wear that with a badge of honor, because I think a troublemaker is somebody who doesn't burn a library down. I think a troublemaker is somebody who engages with democratic institutions to hold both public and private power accountable. And I think that what government has very cleverly done, and I think it's also multinationals. Remember, we fought the pharmaceutical industry, we're currently fighting the telecoms industry, we'll be fighting private educational institutions. So there's a range of struggles that are currently ongoing, and all of these people are leading those struggles, not me. I just provide them with the funding to do so. But what they're saying is that government is very clever, as well as the private sector, in dividing civil society, in creating the good ones and the bad ones. And I think what we need to do 20 years into our democracy in terms of the next phase is consolidate a united civil society voice. I see Comrade Owen Jim just walked in. Now he's talking about a united front, but I think we need to actually convene civil society and convene all of these young leaders, and they should tell us, not the politicians from this morning, they should be telling us what kind of democracy they want, how engaged civil society should be. So to answer his accusation, I think that the NGOs and the community-based organizations are actually very rooted in the communities in which they're operating. They are listening to what communities want, and their struggles and their campaigns are being driven by them. It's not being driven by some, troublemaker sitting in the middle of the center of Cape Town or Johannesburg.
In fact, I also want to say, in the peak of our campaign, as Treatment Action Campaign, we had 20,000 members who were coming from Black African communities. And at that time, if I were to challenge Blade and say, whose voice do you want to hear, if you can't hear those voices, my voice and many of my comrades' voices, because it's even at that time, the question about who are we was as relevant as it is today. So my question is back to Blade himself. Who is he, and who does he represent?
So, Vu, I want to take the next step from that and ask you a question. You've recently left the position. For many years, you were the Secretary General of the Treatment Action Campaign, a large membership-based organization that's fought for the rights of people living with HIV to access treatment, among many other things. So you know communities inside out. And I'd like you to reflect a little bit on what are people on the ground saying about politics and politicians, and what role organizations like the Treatment Action Campaign, now Sonke Gender Justice, what role these organizations play in that kind of interface? Is there a connection, and what is it?
I think, Sisonke, one of the challenges is that many of our organizations do unfortunately attract members who are members of society who are members of political parties, irregardless of which party we are talking about. And people do bring those struggles in the spaces where we talk about social justice issues, either at branch level or at community imbisos. And one of the things that I think comes out clearly in the conversations we are having on the ground is there is a level of frustration at which people do voice their local challenges. For example, either being service delivery or politicians not listening to their voices, only coming when they want to listen, but when it's time for them to deliver, they don't deliver. There is a level of frustration. But in the same vein, that level of frustration is not seen when we have to exercise the right to vote. We do see that level of frustration when we exercise the right to demonstrate against non-delivery. And I think one of the problems is that we as South Africa, we still have a serious challenge around opposition parties in terms of ensuring that actually we do challenge the ruling party, that we have strong oppositions to challenge that, but at the same time, oppositions who are actually going to be listening to what people are saying on the ground without the reactive nature of oppositions where the ANC says, we're going this way, and they say, hold on, you can't go that way. But you have to give us alternatives. What are you proposing? Are those alternatives viable alternatives? Because you're leaving the public with nothing but to vote for what they think sounds viable.
So David, I want to use that to bridge to talk a little bit about Corruption Watch. So one of the things we are told consistently about service delivery protests is that a lot of that is about frustration related to local level corruption. Tell me a little bit about Corruption Watch. It's a new kid on the block. It's a relatively young organization. What niche does it fill?
Let me answer that by reflecting on the question that was asked Vuyiseka about attitudes towards politicians and towards public institutions and indeed private institutions. The cost of corruption, people are fond of trying to measure the cost of corruption in rands and cents, and it's obviously an important measure, very difficult measure. But arguably the greatest and most devastating impact of corruption is on levels of mistrust that develop in public institutions and in private institutions, but key private institutions as well, institutions that you want the public to trust, banks, institutions, firms that bake your bread, that provide your medicine. It's important that a degree of trust reposes in them, and of course in public institutions as well. And the level of mistrust is extremely high. It's extremely high in this country and indeed in many other countries, but it's at a much higher level in this country than at any time since 94. There's no question about it. And we see it in the kind of reports that we're getting and the really quite extensive engagements with large numbers of people, usually in social media and on the various media platforms we run, the media engagements we do, the radio engagements we do, which I find incredibly valuable instruments for gauging public opinion. So we're, as Sisonke said, a 2-year-old NGO set up to encourage public participation in combating corruption. And the form that we encourage that public participation to take is in reporting corruption. In the hope, and the hope is, I think, quite significantly been vindicated, that this would encourage further conversations and further reporting. And that precisely, I think, gives a lie, though I don't even think he begins to believe it, to Blade Nzimande's notion. I find it very difficult to think of Blade Nzimande as the Honourable Blade Nzimande, I have to tell you. But that give the lie to Blade Nzimande's notion that we are just troublemakers, because I'm as old as I am, I remember hearing that from the early 70s through the 80s. It subsided a bit in the 90s. It's now a prevalent way of describing the work that I've always done. And you know, I hope that the model that we're using, and I think it's succeeding, allows us to speak with an authentic voice, because we do speak on the basis of reports we've received. We do identify campaigns on the basis of those reports. And I think that it is important, although I think it's completely legitimate for civil society organizations to be also bodies of experts that provide expert opinions on complex issues. We're not such a body. We try to provide, yes, an intelligent and informed opinion, but we try particularly to be informed by the voices of those for whom we provide a platform to exercise that voice. So that's what we do, and that's the basis on which we do it, because one thing is clear about what it is that we do. There is no combating a problem quite as wicked, and by that I mean quite as complex as corruption, without active public participation.
Thanks, David. Fatima, you've been in 3 spaces. You've worked as an activist, lawyer. You've then advised Minister Hogan, so you've worked within the state. And now you're working, supporting NGOs in South Africa that work at community level. So you have an interesting take that not many people have, different vantage points of looking at civil society and at social justice issues. And one of the things that government tells us repeatedly is that those of us who howl and shout from the outside don't understand how difficult it is to be in the state and to make the kinds of decisions that they have to make. That's been a recurring theme as they try to spin Ganzla, that there's processes and there's things that you don't understand. So I'd like you to tell us a little bit about what the experience of being an activist who then goes into the state is like. How much empathy does that give you with the state? And what do you think the challenges are that the state can respond to? How does the state become better at working with us, right? So we always focus on our challenges as civil society and how we can work better with the state. What does the state need to do to be able to better respond to citizens?
Okay, thanks. I mean, I think the consequence of all of that is that I'm schizophrenic. Because I think if you operate in 3 different sectors, you want to be sympathetic and you want to have empathy for all of the 3 different sectors, but I think underlying everything at the end of it is governance and capacity. So I think the experience in government, and I was fortunate enough to be able to advise a minister who was totally honest, who was not corrupt, who had the utmost integrity, who was the first white woman to be convicted of high treason in apartheid South Africa and was sentenced to 10 years in jail. And I think the first lesson that I learned was that a lot of people's struggle credentials are overlooked even when they operate in the government space, if you don't align yourself with certain interests. Obviously, there's layers of corruption. I, fortunately or unfortunately, had to work in the Department of Public Enterprises, so I can totally understand why Malusi Gigaba felt that he must have been under siege this morning, because I think there are a number of hard choices to make. I think the first thing that government officials have to do is read Section 195 of the Constitution. And I think they need to study it. And then I think the private sector needs to read the entire Bill of Rights and understand that they are not immune from constitutional scrutiny. And I think that that relationship has to be strengthened. The second thing that government has to do as a post-liberation party in power is not to be antagonistic both to private capital and also to civil society organizations. And yes, everybody talks about partnerships, but I've seen it. When government actually works with business and works with civil society, you can get more than 2 million people on ARVs in the country. People who otherwise would have actually suffered, got sick, or died. The second thing, and I think, I keep on telling you about Carl van Holt's paper, but I think you all have to read it because he's done this excellent analysis to show that it's not all just about corruption. The failures in government, in our education, in our health systems, on a range of things, in unpacking what does it mean to be a developmental state. So reference was made to SAA. But I don't ever want to live in a country where my energy is privatized, for all of the concerns and issues with Eskom, and we have to build its capacity and its ability to respond and have transparent pricing and et cetera, and maybe stop building more coal-powered stations and, you know, scrutinize the nuclear deals, for example. But I don't want to live in a country where my energy grid is privatized. We've seen what happens in other countries when basic services are actually privatized and put into the hands of people who need to make a huge amount of profit. So Carl has written this excellent article which shows that it's not all about corruption. That the reason why there's a lot of service delivery failures is that there isn't capacity in the state, and government is reluctant to admit that the people that they have employed do not have the necessary skills or expertise. And that's what the NDP talks about professionalizing the public service. And I've seen that. I've seen that working in government. So I think it's an issue of constraints, it's an issue of hard choices, it's an issue about you're not going to be able to please everybody at the same time. I feel like that is a donor. We can only support 180 organizations. There's probably 500 that need our support, but sometimes you have to make hard choices. And then it's about building the capacity. And then, of course, the fourth thing is for government to understand that they have been elected. Even the DA government in the Western Cape has been elected into power, and therefore they are accountable to the people in Khayelitsha or Manenberg. They're not immune from constitutional scrutiny. And so I think that response of, you are the civil society troublemakers, you are the contrarians, you know, if you were in government, you would be doing the same thing, I think is disrespectful. And it's patronizing.
So just on the, thanks Fatima. On the point about this article, I think let's see if we can get that, a link to that article tweeted, and let's see if any of the young leaders here are willing to summarize it into tweet-sized pieces, at least a few of them, so that it can be more accessible. I want to ask a last question, because I know we're pressed for time. And the question is around threats to civil society. We've seen in the last 5 years a real focus on buckling down on the media and introduction of attempts to really classify more and more information, which has implications for corruption, but it also has deep implications for the media. I wonder if we're going to begin to see similar kinds of threats on the role and voice and space for civil society and social justice organizations, which are rabble-rousers, which are raising questions about Marikana, et cetera, et cetera. So I'd like each of you to talk a little bit about projecting 20 years forward. What do we see happening? Are there real threats? What are they? And do you see us in the next 20 years being a state that has a less or more vibrant civil society sector? I'll start with David, because you two have been speaking.
You know, I'm not sure that I do see grave threats to civil society on the horizon, but I think it's as well for civil society to behave always as if there were grave threats on the horizon. I mean, I think what happened with civil society, and indeed I think what happened with government, is that after 1994 it went to sleep, with marked exceptions, like, for example, the Treatment Action Campaign. But for the rest, I think that we thought we'd, you know, reached the finishing line, and then we decamped to government to exercise power, or to the private sector to make lots of money, and actually forgot that your government really is as good as you deserve. And we gave government untrammeled power for 10, 15 years, and to expect that they are going to hand that over without a fight is ludicrous. And I think that now there is a robust fight on. It's not always adversarial. There are really constructive relations with the state. They've responded, by and large, quite well to the work that we're doing, not without initial resistance and not without great exceptions. But I don't think that we're about to head into a sort of Central Asian type dictatorship. But I think civil society needs to defend itself even in good times, let alone in bad times. Because if you don't defend yourself in good times, the bad times will sure as hell come. The temptation to abuse public power and to abuse public resources and the incentives to do so is so great that I'm cynical enough to believe that it will never be resisted unless there is active scrutiny of those who are given that power and who are given access to those resources. So No, I don't fear a dictatorship on the horizon by any stretch of the imagination. But yes, I think that we should conduct ourselves in our everyday life as though that were always a possibility.
I would be remiss if I let the microphone go without a word about Nkandla, and specifically, I'd like to know your thoughts on what the public and civil society response has been to the Office of the Public Protector. So you can say what you like about the report, but I'm also interested in what we've seen emerging around a sort of rallying and a defense of the Office of the Public Protector.
Yeah, I take quite a lot of encouragement from what has been happening around Nkandla, because it's an exercise, a breathtaking exercise in impunity, and yet punishment has been meted out and is being meted out all the time. I think this has been enormously costly to the president. I think it's been enormously costly to the ruling party. I think it's been enormously costly to government. And I'm not cheering all of that, because that fallout, that lack of trust that develops in consequence not only of the person's reputation being diminished, but the reputation of high officers of state, institutions of government being diminished, is a consequence of Nkandla. But the level of outrage expressed has also been extremely gratifying. And it serves precisely to isolate those who are corrupt from those who are not corrupt, including those thousands, tens of thousands of people in the public sector who are as aggrieved and as appalled by what happened as any of us are. The other side of Nkandla is the outpouring of support for the public protector. And in many ways, the most appalling outcome of Nkandla are the attempts, I think entirely unsuccessful, to discredit the public protector. The public protector I find an interesting person. I think she's speaking later, or she has spoken already. Quite a low-key person. And somebody who mistakenly thought that what it said in the statute was what she was meant to do, that she was meant to work without fear or favor. And that's what she's done. It's not really rocket science. It's just like a good, honest public servant doing what she was meant to do. And I think that right now she is probably the most credible public figure in the country. And lessons should be learnt from that. And so, yes, the outrage at Nkandla encourages me, and the support for the public protector encourages me. But I think that the lesson from this is, if you want to think about what a good short-term campaign is, it's to protect the public protector, because she has her term of a fight over that issue, because I think that any government, whatever it is that is in power, will be loath to appoint another public protector who truly believes that her role is to be an independent ombud, as the current public protector naively does. And God bless her naivety. I mean, long may it continue, but that certainly wasn't what I think was intended.
So I think I'll come to you about the threats. I want to get back to the threats question, but I think a nice kind of summary of that is not only that we need to protect the public protector now, meaning the current protector, the public protector, but I think we need to protect the office, which means watching that space in the next 2.5 to 3 years, that we mustn't get lured by the kind of culture of celebrity that we all get lured on and think that the public protector is Thuli Madonsela. The public protector is an office. And we have an amazing public protector, and we need to maintain the integrity that she has put in there by making sure that the appointments is watched with vigilance. Yeah? Thanks for that, David. That's an important point. Fatima, threats to civil society. Do we have a looming dictatorship in which this kind of conversation will no longer be possible in 20 years' time?
So I'm speaking now in my personal capacity. Yeah, I mean, Dave, I agree that we're not going to have a dictatorship. And my reasons for that would be very different from why other people think we're not going to have a dictatorship. I think we're not going to have a dictatorship, not because of some grand ideal commitment to the principles of our constitution and democracy, but I think because there's too many people waiting in line to now benefit from being number one. And so that's why we won't have a dictatorship, because of the internal sort of competition for resources. And so great. People often say that the greatest opposition is within the ANC, and so I'm all for that. But while we may not have a dictatorship, and that's not what keeps me up at night, Justin and I, who works with me at OSFSA, have just been around the country with our entire team for the past 3 weeks. And what we are hearing from organizations on the ground in communities, and young people in particular in civil society, is that there is a serious reversal already happening of our constitutional gains and our democratic gains. And of course I'm a constitutionalist, but I think even the Archbishop Thabo Makgoba is a constitutionalist. I think even the atheists are constitutionalists, because right now that's the only document that embodies what we're supposed to do as a democracy. And what they are saying to us is that they're not paranoid. There is a serious attempt to reverse gains from within the state, but also through collusion with vested private interests. And so that's why I'm going to keep on saying at every forum that we have to scrutinize the private sector, and we have to scrutinize the mechanisms by which private capital is being accumulated in this country.
So say a bit more about that, Fatima. So illustrate that. So
So let me give you the examples. We are supporting organizations, and all of them are here, so if you want to speak to them to find out what's actually happening at the Marikana Commission of Inquiry, what's actually happening at the Sereti Commission of Inquiry, which nobody hardly is tweeting about. It's not being televised live. I'm just not sure where the journalists are on that particular issue. And the activists who are working on the Kailicha Commission of Inquiry will tell you that the evidence being presented at those 3 commissions of inquiry currently in this country is showing massive evidence of not just corruption, but a severe disdain for constitutional protections and for constitutional principles. And what they're concerned about is the increasing securitization of a sect within the government. And that is the relationship between the SAPS, and you had Riyadh talking about that now, and you should all watch that documentary because it's excellent. And it gives you an explanation, it illustrates why we are concerned about the abuse of state power. But it's the state security cluster with the state police, which is where the evidence is emerging in all 3 of those commissions. The Right to Know campaign, which we support, will tell you that activists around the country are being surveilled. So we've heard what Snowden, has said about Human Rights Watch, about Amnesty International being under surveillance, and what our own organizations in South Africa are telling us is it's already happening here. It's currently happening here. We've also had assassinations of activists in Durban. So my final response, I think then, is that for me right now, the only credible check on the exercise of public and private power in the next 20 years is going to be civil society. And as the old saying goes, if you were in the trade union movement or if you were an activist, it's time to mobilize.
You have the last word.
I agree fully with Fatima, and I'm not going to repeat the fact that we need to guard against the constitution and abuse of the state in undermining what the Constitution means for many of us, for many poor communities. But I also want to raise the issue, not that it surprises us, the issue of divide and rule used by the state. I want to use the state and parties in dividing civil society. That is a real threat. It's a real threat because I think what happens in COSATU and what is happening in COSATU cannot be celebrated by any civil society organization, because it's division of COSATU to weaken civil society, because COSATU is about poor working class workers, and that's every one of us has a worker in their own household who's underpaid. Many examples that I can use. So we cannot celebrate what happens in COSATU. We have to consolidate a civil society in ensuring what happens in COSATU actually can be resolved quite soon, because we're going to end up with a disillusioned sector that is very important. And another one that I want to raise is the fact that we also have another aspect, I think, which is a threat in the future. It's now being muted, but I think it will resurface in the future. There is an emergence. Again, it doesn't surprise us because we knew that they do exist in many of the political parties, the traditionalists, who want to silence many people like Sisonke and myself, who are called children. We don't qualify to be called young women activists. We are called children who are calling for traditional courts bill not to ever exist in South Africa. Those are some of the examples that I'm using as using legislation to silence the rights of women, particularly women in rural areas, to ask the government to deal radically with the issue of gender-based violence, because gender-based violence is killing young women and girls in South Africa in high numbers. Like 27 women are killed every week. Should we accept that? And I think that's a serious threat in the sense that we know those traditionalists are there in the courts, they are there in legislation, they are there in parliaments, they are there in government, and we have to guard against that. And some of them are amongst ourselves as civil society. And lastly, there is a threat, but though it's still being, and I think probably Comrade Blade is the champion of this one, there is a suspicion that there is an NGO bill to regulate civil society in South Africa in future. We are looking out, and any emergence of such, and I think any civil society and anyone who respects who is a social justice activist in South Africa should be on the alert, because one of the things that they want to do, they don't want to give rights to civil society, like many of us on this stage, to say the things that we are saying openly and freely, because they think we have too much power. And because we are challenging the power of the state, therefore our power has to be limited, as they have done through the promotion of access to information, as they have done with many other legislations post-liberation. And we cannot afford that as South Africans, we cannot afford it for our democracy.
Thanks, Vu. So I think we end on that note, this idea that we are increasingly looking at a society where there's a rule by law, laws used to rule us rather than a rule of law. I think it's an important distinction that Vu is raising. I continue to be amazed every time I talk to civil society people about what tremendous talent we have in this country, and a little bit sad about the fact that so many of us have to choose to be on this platform rather than a political platform because of what it continues to signify. So thank you for listening to us, and we're done.
Know more about your world. eNCA.com